So it's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Park, who's in the College of Arts and Sciences and assistant professor of psychology at University of Oregon. Um, Research area is really interesting and really timely, really doing the important work to move away from the question of what works to how do we get what works into the hands of people who can really benefit from it. And very much looking forward to this talk and how it can be informative for the work we are all doing with children and families in our own research and clinical initiatives. So without further ado, welcome. Very much looking forward to the talk today.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm so excited to be here with all of you. As was mentioned, a lot of my research focuses on what we call dissemination and implementation science. I'll give a brief introduction in a moment, but that's really thinking about translating what all of you are researching and really taking kind of the latest breaking things and really figuring out how do we translate that to provide the best quality mental health care for youth and families. And I'm going to focus on a particular topic within that today, which is cultural humility. And so that's where a lot of my work has been centered over the past several years, is really figuring out how can we take research on cultural competence, cultural humility, and I'll talk a little bit about both of those in a moment, and really translate those into clinical practice with youth and families. I have no conflicts of interest or disclosures to report for today's presentation. So I'd love to get to know you a little bit more. So perhaps in the chat, you can go ahead and type your name, your position, so whether you're a grad student or not. And then I'm curious how you would define cultural humility. And there's no right or wrong answers here. There's actually no right or wrong answers because what I'll talk about in a moment is that we don't have uniform definitions of cultural humility. But just curious how folks would define cultural humility. As those are rolling into the chat, I wanted to do a brief introduction about myself so you can get a sense of who I am and where I'm coming from. And so my name's Dr. Elena Park. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Oregon. I was born and raised in Los Angeles, California. I am a second generation Chinese Korean immigrant. And I am monolingual English speaking because when my parents came to the United States, they came because they wanted to pursue the American dream and very much adopted American culture. And I say all this because, as we'll talk about in a moment, all this is going to inform how I think about research, how I think about mental health, and this might inform how you think about research, how you think about mental health, and how the children and families who you work with think about mental health as well. I should also mention that I use she, her pronouns. So again, second generation Chinese Korean immigrant born and raised in Los Angeles, California. I had the privilege of coming from a middle class family where I was encouraged to pursue a career in something I cared about and something that interested me. I kind of fell into psychology, and I'm happy to talk about more of that pathway separately, but completed my bachelor's degree at the University of California, Los Angeles, or UCLA, in psychology, and ultimately pursued a clinical psychology PhD at UCLA as well. And here I was really studying dissemination implementation science and how could we translate these treatments that are supported by research into community mental health and school settings for children and families. In doing that work in Los Angeles, which is very racial, ethnically diverse, also recognize that we might need to adapt some of our treatments to really have the most impact with racial and ethnic minoritized families. And so I'm trained as a dissemination implementation scientist, but have since done more and more work related to mental health disparities and cultural adaptation and cultural humility. and I'm currently an assistant professor at the University of Oregon. All right, so for today's talk, we'll talk a little bit about what is cultural humility, and I appreciate seeing some of the things that are coming in through the chat. We'll talk about a framework proposed by one of my colleagues, Dr. Shardi Galan, that breaks down cultural humility into cultural knowledge, cultural skills, critical self-reflection, recognition of power imbalances, and also institutional accountability, and what each of those dimensions of cultural humility means. And then I'll leave some time at the end for any questions that folks might have. All right, so I mentioned that there's no uniform definition of cultural humility. That said, it's going to be really difficult to give a talk on cultural humility without some sort of without operationally defining it. So for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to define cultural humility as an individual's cultural knowledge, skills, and self-awareness, and efforts to redress power imbalances. Again, I've been doing some of this work with Dr. Shardi Galan at Penn State University, and this is how we've been defining cultural humility in some of our work. So folks have probably heard the term cultural humility. Folks have probably heard the term cultural competence, cultural adaptation. Many times these terms are used interchangeably, but I'll talk about some nuances between those terms throughout today's talk. When we think about cultural humility, which is really cultural knowledge, cultural skills, but also consideration of those power imbalances between clients and clinicians, when we address all of those different factors, we see that that can help with clinicians broaching more cultural issues in therapy, which can lead to better client engagement. And when I talk about client engagement, I'm talking about the therapeutic alliance between clinicians and clients. I'm also talking about session attendance and also talking about participation in treatment sessions as well. And then we see that cultural humility is also associated with better client mental health outcomes as well. I do want to note that a lot of these outcomes have been studied with adults, but we have no reason to believe that we wouldn't see the same benefits with children and families as well. And the work that we have seen done in this space with children and families do show promise of cultural humility. So I mentioned that I want to distinguish a bit between cultural competence and cultural humility. I recognize that many folks are off camera, so can I get a quick show of hands, or you can use maybe the thumbs up emoji if you've heard of the term cultural competence. Some folks, great. What if you've heard the term cultural humility? Okay, seeing some folks as well. And what about folks who feel super confident in the difference between cultural competence versus cultural humility? Okay, I saw a lot of smiles there, and I'm right there with you. So let's think about, or I can talk about how I distinguish cultural competence versus cultural humility. But again, I want to say that a lot of times these are used interchangeably. And if you look in the literature, you can often see that some of the definitions are even used interchangeably as well. But again, for the purpose of this talk, I want to present a model, a conceptual model that Dr. Shardi Galan and I have been studying a bit more closely. So universally, what we can see is that cultural competence usually refers to that cultural knowledge and cultural skills. And what I mean by that, so cultural knowledge, how much do you know about a particular social group's beliefs, values, and practices? So a lot of times this is covered in our culture and mental health classes or in other classes about particular social groups. We might get a sense of what are customs practiced by that social group. We might get a sense of what are some of the holidays that are celebrated by that cultural group, for instance. That's how I would conceptualize cultural knowledge. And then cultural skills, how do we apply that knowledge to our clinical work? So given that I know that there's certain holidays that are celebrated by particular social groups, for instance, if I'm working with a client who identifies with that social group, I might make sure to wish them to say something when that holiday is approaching. Or if I know there's a certain belief or a certain custom, for instance, I might mention that belief or that custom in my work with clients. So those are that cultural skills. We're really taking that knowledge and we're applying that knowledge in our clinical work. So these are the foundations for cultural competence. The other thing that I want to mention in a recent review that we did with Dr. Stan Huey is that we can see this cultural competence training. So when we do trainings in cultural competence, whether it's a workshop or something else about what are the beliefs, practices, values of particular social groups, and then how can we integrate those beliefs, values, and practices into our clinical work, that does lead to self-reported improvements in clinician multicultural competence. But we actually don't see as much evidence that self-reported multicultural competence actually improves client engagement or outcomes. And then we also don't see any sort of relationship between cultural competence trainings and client engagement and improvement. So the kind of example that I give a lot of times is we can read a ton of books about how to ride a bicycle. We can have someone talk at us about how to ride a bicycle, but that doesn't necessarily mean that with all that training, you get put on a bicycle, that you know how to ride that bicycle, for instance. So we say the same thing for training. That said, what I really want to emphasize is that there is a purpose of that training. And so when we think about cultural humility, which again, we do see leads to better broaching of cultural issues, better client engagement, better client outcomes, we can think about cultural competence as really forming the foundation of what we need for cultural humility. That we cannot have cultural humility without first having cultural knowledge and cultural skills. Cultural humility builds off of cultural competence. And so we can think about cultural humility as also incorporating critical self-reflection. So not only knowledge about our clients' social groups and their beliefs, values, and practices, but also thinking about our positionality and the perspectives that we bring into the room as clinicians. We can recognize power imbalances. So we automatically have a power imbalance between clients and their clinicians, and that clinicians hold a lot more power than our clients. But depending on the identity of the clinician and depending on the identity of the client, there might be power imbalances based off of those identities in the current environment, or thinking about historical power imbalances as well. And then the last thing we want to think about is institutional accountability. And so those power imbalances might affect the clinician and client interaction, but those power imbalances can also usually be seen in some of our practices and some of our institutions as well. And I'll talk more about that in a bit. And so we want to recognize that if there are biases that are being upheld by certain practices or certain institutions, that we as clinicians think about how we might point out some of those biases so that they're not negatively impacting our clients. All right. I know I'm setting all of this up, but just want to set up a little bit more in terms of terminology. So when I use the term culture, I'm talking about cultural humility, I'm talking about cultural competence. I'm really referring to the attitudes, beliefs, norms, roles, and self-definitions shared and practiced by particular social groups. And the social group I'm going to focus on in particular is race and ethnicity, because working with racial and ethnic minoritized youth and families is my particular area of expertise. But we can think about social groups in terms of age, disability, religion, sexual orientation, and so on. And so we can practice cultural humility, and we should practice cultural humility in regards to all aspects of our client's identity, but just want to preface that today's talk will focus a lot on racial ethnic groups. All right, so first definition or first dimension of cultural competence or cultural humility is this cultural knowledge. And so again, we can think about these as what is our actual knowledge about this cultural group. So for instance, if I'm thinking about Latin clients, I might think about Latin cultural values being things like machismo, Marianismo, personalismo, familismo, simpatia, and respeto, for instance. I have their definitions on the screen. For today's talk, I'm not going to go into as much into each of these cultural values, but we can think about, okay, am I as a clinician aware that these cultural values exist for people from Latin culture, for instance? Then we can think about how do we incorporate those values or some of those beliefs into our actual work with clients. And so we can do this in a few different ways. We can do this through assessment. And so there are standardized assessments out there that can help you incorporate cultural beliefs, values, practices into your clinical work. So something like the cultural formulation interview, for instance, which is a 16-item semi-structured interview that asks about cultural factors that influence ideological beliefs about mental health, coping, self-help, for instance. And so a question from the cultural formulation interview, which has a lot of its own research evidence, is something like, do you sometimes feel different than other children your age? In what way? I do want to note the cultural formulation interview is designed to be implemented with adults, but there is a separate child supplement that discusses how you could frame questions from the cultural formulation interview for both children, but also their parents as well. So we could think about using something like the cultural formulation interview if we're trying to enhance our cultural skills. We can also think, if we're focusing on race and ethnicity, about administering standardized surveys like the multi-group ethnic identity measure, for instance, which is a 12-item measure that asks about a child client's racial ethnic identity. And what I mean by racial ethnic identity, so for instance, I mentioned earlier, I'm Chinese and Korean. So if I'm filling out a questionnaire, I might check off that I'm Asian, for instance. Just because I check off that I'm Asian doesn't necessarily mean that I identify as Asian. And so when we think about our racial ethnic identity, it's how much does that person identify with the racial ethnic category that they might be placed into. Again, thinking about those Latin cultural values, someone might check off that they're Latin or Hispanic, for instance, on a questionnaire, but it doesn't mean that they necessarily identify as Latin or Hispanic. So we can give standardized questionnaires to figure out how much do our clients identify with their racial ethnic categorization. We could also think about giving out questionnaires that ask specifically about cultural values. So one Latin cultural value is familismo. And so we can think about administering something like the familism scale, for instance, which is a 15-item self-report survey that asks how much our client identifies with the cultural value of familismo, for instance. Because if our client's not identifying with a particular racial ethnic group, if they're not identifying with a particular cultural value, then it would be a mismatch to be incorporating that cultural value into our treatment with our clients. So we can think about assessment. We also want to think about case conceptualization. And I'm about to show a really cool case conceptualization model that was developed by Dr. Amanda Sanchez, who is an alum of this program. So really cool work by Dr. Amanda Sanchez. And Dr. Sanchez's recent case conceptualization model that's specifically for youth with anxiety or OCD talks about situating the client's presenting problem within the cultural context, shaping the treatment support team, identifying a cohesive set of strategies to address youth needs. And I'll talk more about that in a moment, because treatment planning, figuring out how you incorporate cultural beliefs, values, practices into your treatment might be easier said than done. But it is part of your case conceptualization that we need to be thinking about ahead about what treatment practices are going to be helpful for this particular client. Determining, if any, what advocacy steps are needed, and also identifying and generating strategies for engagement. And so I've mentioned client engagement on a number of different slides so far. For racial, ethnic, minoritized youth and minoritized youth of various social groups, we do tend to see that there are disproportionate barriers to receiving high quality treatment for youth from minoritized groups. And so we really need to be proactively thinking about how do we engage minoritized youth, because if we're not engaging minoritized youth, then they're certainly not benefiting from treatment. And then if they're not benefiting from treatment, they're not getting the really, really good outcomes that we can see from some of those evidence-based treatments. So this is a very brief overview of how we might incorporate culture into our case conceptualization. This is part of the RESPECT toolkit, and I've also included a QR code if anyone is interested in learning more about Dr. Sanchez's RESPECT toolkit for youth anxiety and OCD. It has tools for case conceptualization, but it also has several other tools for incorporating culture into treatment for youth anxiety and OCD, and is just a really cool toolkit. All right, and then I mentioned this is the third step in the case conceptualization, in Dr. Sanchez's case conceptualization, but we need to think about how we incorporate culture into our treatment with racial, ethnic, minoritized clients. So a couple pieces of background information that I want to present just to situate us. When we look at what treatments are evidence-based for racial, ethnic, minoritized youth, this was a review done by Armando Pina, Antonio Polo, and Stan Huey, published in 2019. We can see the first column talks about different mental health concerns. So anxiety, depression, disruptive behavior problems, trauma, for instance. The actual paper, which is cited at the bottom of the slide, goes into more mental health concerns. And then what I'm about to show you, each subsequent column shows treatments that have various levels of support for that mental health concern and that have been tested with various populations. So level 1, well-established treatment, we see that these are treatments that have been tested in some sort of randomized controlled trial, and they've been shown to either be superior to another active intervention or equivalent to another well-established treatment. So we can see, for instance, lots of research evidence for cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, for Hispanic or Latina youth. We could see multisystemic therapy, for instance, lots of evidence, lots of good evidence for African American youth with disruptive behavior problems. Level 2 treatments, maybe not as much research support as that level 1 treatment, but we still have strong research support. We're still seeing that it's superior to, it's been tested in a randomized clinical trial. It's been shown to be superior to another treatment. We see level 3, again, slightly less support. Maybe this is tested in a randomized clinical trial and it is shown to be superior to a wait list or no treatment control condition, but still shown to have positive outcomes. Level 4 treatments, again, still positive outcomes here, but we're seeing that maybe these level 4 treatments have not been tested in a randomized clinical trial, but maybe we're seeing beneficial pre-post effects, for instance. So I want to say all the treatments that have been shown up to this point, we're still seeing seem to work well. And then level 5 treatments is where we actually get to is this treatment potentially detrimental to a racial ethnic minoritized group? And one thing I really want to point out is we don't see any treatments in this category. And so we can see that this list is somewhat sparse. And so we actually don't really know if evidence-based, we don't have great evidence that evidence-based treatments are super effective for racial ethnic minoritized youth, but we also don't have evidence that they're harmful as well. And we'll come back to kind of the point of this later, but this is to say, we can probably start out with our evidence-based treatments because there's a lot of research support. That's why they're evidence-based. And we can think about, and because some of this chart is a little bit sparse, then we can think about how do we incorporate culture. And again, one of the reasons why this chart of evidence-based treatments for ethnic, racial, minoritized youth is sparse is because we just haven't tested that many treatments with racial, ethnic, minoritized youth. So the pie chart that I have on the screen right now shows the racial ethnic demographics of the US population. When we look at the racial ethnic participants that have been included, racial ethnic minoritized or racial ethnic participants who have been included in randomized clinical trials with youth, we can see a lot of our treatments have been tested with white youth, maybe a quarter have been tested with Hispanic or Latina youth, maybe a fourth to a third have been tested with Black or African American youth. And then we see very, very few treatment or very, very few randomized clinical trials have actually been tested with youth of other races or ethnicities. Now, this huge blank portion, this kind of 25% or so blank portion that we see in the randomized controlled trial samples means that race or ethnicity was not reported in that randomized controlled trial. So again, we don't know that we don't have great evidence that evidence-based treatments are super effective or might generalize to racial ethnic minoritized youth, but we're also not seeing that they're harmful for racial ethnic minoritized youth. And actually we're seeing more evidence that they might generalize than we're seeing evidence that they are harmful. Okay, the other piece of information that I want to show is Stan Huey in 2014 looked at meta-analyses comparing or meta-analyses of evidence-based treatments for racial ethnic minoritized populations. And in 62% of those meta-analyses found no ethnicity effects. So again, if we are working with an ethnic racial minoritized client and a particular treatment has not been tested for that racial ethnic minoritized group, we can think about still starting with our evidence-based treatments like cognitive behavioral therapy, like behavioral parent training, for instance. All right, that said, we are seeing that sometimes culture might play a role in how effective a treatment is for a particular client. So this is a process, a decision-making process that our lab has really started to study. I did a full presentation on this about a year ago, a full webinar on this, and I have the QR code to that webinar if folks are interested in going into more detail about this process. But as I mentioned, our current team's recommendations are to just start out with delivering an evidence-based treatment. It's evidence-based for a reason. There's a lot of research evidence supporting that these treatments work well, even if they haven't been tested with specific populations. That said, as we're delivering our evidence-based treatment, we want to assess whether the client is engaged and progressing. And hopefully we as clinicians are just doing this anyway. We're paying attention to our clients showing up to sessions. Do they seem to be engaged in sessions? How is my therapeutic alliance with my clients? Is my client making the progress that I would expect them to be making in treatment? So hopefully we're monitoring this in our just good clinical practice anyway, but we really just want to pay attention to this, especially for when we're working with clients with minoritized identities, because we know that there can be a lot of engagement barriers for clients with minoritized identities. So delivering our evidence-based treatment, routinely assessing whether a client is engaged and progressing. If they are, great. Things seem to be working. If things seem to be working, let's continue doing the things that are working. If they're not, then we want to try to think about, is the reason why our client's not engaged or not progressing related to a mismatch between the treatment that I'm offering and this client's cultural values, beliefs, and practices? And again, that might not be the only reason why a client is not engaged or not progressing, but we really want to consider it. And then we want to consider if there does seem to be some sort of cultural mismatch, what are the specific risk factors or what are the specific resilience factors that might be a mismatch between this client's beliefs, values, and practices and the treatment that I'm offering them. Based on those cultural risk and resilience factors, we want to think about what would be appropriate ways to culturally adapt treatment. We're going to implement those cultural adaptations, reevaluate the client's engagement and progress. And then if we're satisfied with the client's engagement and progress, then maybe we return back to the original treatment plan. If we're not, then maybe we think about, is there another cultural adaptation that might address some of the cultural mismatches that I'm observing here. Again, I recognize this was a really fast overview. More details provided in that QR code if folks are interested in learning more about this model and potential cultural adaptations that you can incorporate into your own practice. All right, so far I've talked about that foundational cultural competence piece of cultural humility. And I really don't want to underscore how important that is for practicing not only cultural competence, but also practicing cultural humility. If we want to kind of think about that next layer, though, of cultural humility, we can start thinking about critical self-reflection. There's a variety of ways to do this. Dr. Pamela Hayes has an addressing model, which is an acronym that stands for various social identities that we can consider in our clinical work, not only for our clients, but also for ourselves. And so again, Dr. Pamela Hayes has really excellent literature on this. I'm just going to summarize some of the things included in her work. But asking ourselves questions, for instance, of do we identify with a particular generation? When were we born? What were the social expectations of a person of our identity? What are they now? Were we brought up in a religious or spiritual tradition? Do we identify with a religion or have a spiritual practice now? What do we consider our racial ethnic identity? And how do people identify us? And are these the same? What's our sexual orientation? How has our minority or dominant sexual orientation affected our relationships, education, and work experiences? What were and are gender-related roles and expectations for us? So we can really start to answer these questions and get a sense of not only what are the social identities that we have, but how are those social identities influencing how we move through the world? The other thing that we want to be thinking about is not only what are social identities, but what are perhaps the privileges or marginalization that we experience based off of those social identities. So Dr. Hayes has, in a lot of her books and research articles, talks about these various social identities or cultural influences, and then which groups within the United States that are privileged in that area or that tend to be marginalized in that area. And so again, not only thinking for ourselves, what are our social identities, but also do we experience privilege or do we experience perhaps marginalization because of how those identities are situated within the United States. So we want to think about ourselves, but then we also want to think about how our social identities intersect with those of our clients. And so we can ask ourselves the same questions, but about our clients. So what might be the generational influences relevant to our client? Did my client grow up in a religious or spiritual practice? Do they currently have a religious or spiritual practice? And how does its presence or absence affect their worldview? What is my client's racial ethnic identity? How is my client perceived based on their experience? What is my client's sexual orientation? Do those around them affirm their sexual orientation? And what were and are the gender-related roles and expectations in my client's family, culture, and religion? Again, these are only a sampling of social identities, but these can help us start to think about the social identities that our clients hold. And then we want to think about, again, for ourselves, for instance, what are the social identities that we hold? Are those social identities privileged or marginalized? For our clients, what social identities do our clients hold? Are those social identities privileged or marginalized? And then we really want to pay attention to where could be the mismatch between my social identities and my client's social identities. So for instance, if I have privilege as it relates to age or generational status because I am an adult, for instance, whereas my client is a child, and by nature of how things work in the United States, has a lot less privilege than an adult in the United States, then they might have that marginalized identity, for instance. So we want to think about our social identities and how they interact with our client social identities. Also remembering that the therapeutic relationship is inherently imbalanced in that the clinician will have more power than our clients. And if we're practicing cultural humility, it's not changing your social identities, but it's recognizing that we might be having a lot of power in the room, not only because we're clinicians, but because of our visible identities, like our race, like our age, for instance, or our invisible identities, like our sexual orientation, like our religion, for instance. All right, the last aspect we want to think about is institutional accountability. So those power imbalances can affect our interpersonal interactions with our clients. We can also see those power imbalances being held up by practices and institutions based on historical status relations. And so if we are practicing institutional accountability, these are some recommendations by Victoria Plott, who's a really big name in diversity science. Article at the bottom of the screen, but we want to be thinking about being wary of color blindness. So color blindness is I don't see color. Everyone is kind of starting off from the same place. But we know that there's a history of who has had power in the United States, and that history of who has had power in the United States impacts our current practices, laws, institutions, media. And so we want to be wary of color blindness. And so we can be wary of color blindness by encouraging our organizations to continue offering or mandating continuing education in cultural and individual differences and diversity. So we know cultural and individual differences and diversity, that's one of the requirements for APA accredited programs. And so we want to make sure that we're learning about that in graduate school, but also outside of graduate school as well. We also want to consider aligning what we do in what we should do in ambiguous situations with what we actually do. And so many folks, especially if you are educating yourself in cultural individual differences and diversity, might have a value of diversity or might have a value of inclusion. And in situations where it's clear what the right thing to do would be or what the wrong thing to do would be. We do the right thing. But in ambiguous situations, it can be less clear. And so if we're noticing in ambiguous situations that perhaps our biases are coming up or other people's biases are coming up, then we can just being wary of color blindness by thinking about, okay, what is my gut telling me I should do in this situation? And then how can I follow through with that? Recognizing that in those ambiguous situations, what might prevent us from acting is some of those kind of longstanding or institutional biases. We can think about adopting identity conscious approaches. So recognizing that implicit bias can impact our decisions and actions. And we all have implicit biases as human beings. We are just programmed with them. And so just recognizing that as humans, we do have these implicit biases and they are going to impact us. And the more we can recognize that, the more that we can decide consciously how we want to act in those situations. We can also engage in some perspective taking. So thinking about how our client might feel in certain situations or what our client's experience might be given their social identities. And then we can also facilitate racial socialization. So these might be conversations between parents and their children about the meaning of race or about the existence of racism, for instance. And then we can also reflect on cues that are sent to staff, students, and clients about inclusion. So we can call in or call out instances of discrimination. One of the things that we talk about in our program, if we're calling out instances of discrimination, is using the term ouch. So if someone hears discrimination, kind of prefacing it with like, ooh, ouch, okay, that hit me. And then we can gift each other how we might act differently in those situations to avoid any sort of discriminatory behaviors. We can also ensure that our organizations have interpretation services for clients who might speak languages other than English. And we can also do things, again, these are just examples. This is not an all-inclusive list of doing things like distributing red cards. And so here's an example of a red card. It's a physical red card that talks about anyone who's currently living in the United States, their constitutional rights. Through this QR code, you can print out red cards for free. And this could be a cue if you have them in your waiting room, for instance, for clients to potentially pick up and hand potentially to an immigration officer, for instance, if they encounter an immigration officer. This is a cue that you're kind of understanding how institutions, how practices can impact a client's daily experience and sending cues that it might be a safe space for this client as well. All right, that was my rapid fire overview of cultural humility. I have my email here if anyone has questions or wants to follow up separately. I'm noticing we also have about 13 more minutes for questions if anyone has any now. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. What a terrific talk. So much great information was packed into that so efficiently. I was super, it's not often I get to sit through a talk where both those things are present. Really terrific job. Does anybody have any questions?
Good afternoon, Dr. Park. I do have a question. And
Yeah.
sorry, there's a lot of background noise behind me. Great presentation. I have a fairly limited clinical experience, but so far, my sense is that the client's ability to have that level of self-introspection to identify those values that are meaningful to them often don't come about at like intake and even like in the first 5 sessions. And for me, it's made it hard to build a case conceptualization with their differing identities when I frankly just don't know. And I can take it at face value. Like maybe they dropped a comment that they go to church, but I don't know what that means to them. I don't know what that community means to them. So I want to hear your thoughts about those experiences so that we can bear in mind. And, professors ask, how do you think their culture impacts their presenting conditions? And I'm like, I have no idea. Like, I talked to them for an hour.
Yes, I love this question. And we actually use the cultural formulation interview, which is one of the measures that I recommended in our clinic. And as a clinical supervisor in our clinic, I am constantly seeing our students ask this question and our clients kind of not mention any social identities. They're like, oh, you like just explicitly asked about it. And so I think it's hard in the intake because the intake is a client's first encounter with their clinician. And especially with marginalized or minoritized identities, that's a really big step to say, oh, I'm going to trust this person who I just met and disclose that I have these marginalized or minoritized identities. And so it might take a bit of time for our clients to open up about it. I would say ways that you can go about that might be a little bit more what we might consider like implicit versus explicit. So we can directly ask our clients about their social identities. We can also ask them, especially with kids who might not be able to actually name that social identity, ask them about who are the other kids that you hang out with in school. Do you feel different than the other kids in your school? Why do you feel different than the other kids in your school? What are you bringing to lunch? Or what does an average lunch look like? One that can just give us a sense of physical health, which we know physical health can impact our mental health, but it can also give us a sense of some of their cultural values. If they're bringing tamales, for instance, to lunch every day, then that can give us a sense of, okay, maybe, maybe there is kind of a racial ethnic component here. What do you typically do over the weekends? And they might mention, okay, every weekend I go to church, for instance, or I go to Sunday school. So what are you doing over weekends? Who does your family hang out with? How did your family meet those friends, for instance? So trying to get a sense of their social network, especially for kids, do they feel different? Do they not feel different? Thinking about, especially in places like Miami, for instance, which does tend to have a more Latinx population. If they don't feel different, is that because they're with other kids who are also Latinx, for instance? And so taking into account kind of the neighborhoods that you're in, what neighborhood do they live in? Because we know that different neighborhoods can look different. And so I think there's more discrete ways that we can ask about it. For adolescents, for instance, have you had a romantic relationship? Who was that romantic relationship with? So really asking about these different aspects of their identities. And also, I would say, as much as we might want to do it directly from the intake, something like case conceptualization is an ongoing process. And so if it's 3, 4, 5 sessions in, and that's when our client decides we're a safe person to disclose a certain aspect of their identity to, we want to bring that in and we want to talk to our clinical supervisors about, my client just brought this up. What does it mean that they're bringing this up 5 sessions in, type of a thing? And even processing that with our client, like, oh, that seems like it's, an important aspect of who you are. Like, I'm wondering I'm really glad you decided to share that with me. And I'm wondering kind of why you're bringing this up with me now. And that might speak to like, maybe they're not out about that particular identity with other people in their lives. Who else have you told this to, especially for invisible identities, for instance? So I think there's a lot of meaningful work that can happen through that disclosure process. I'm seeing in the chat, I've had a difficult time using the cultural formulation interview with youth and helping them reflect their cultural values and beliefs. Do you have any recommendations to using this interview with youth?
Dr. Park, yeah, thank you. That was me. I think you did a wonderful job answering my question with a needs question originally. So I did want to say though, like this presentation was really informative. I really appreciated it. And it was making me think about my own research. I just did a meta-analysis, and one of the variables I was interested in was like ethnicity, like cultural aspects that influence psychotherapies in primary care, because there's a lot of like emerging evidence that it may be a good setting for racial and ethnic
Yeah.
groups. And it was very frustrating because there's so many papers that did not report race and ethnicity, like what you said. There's like a big chunk missing, and like close to half of the papers did not report it. So like in terms of like a moderator, it was really hard to test. But what we found was like kind of disheartening. It was basically saying that like racial and ethnic marginalized groups may not benefit from services as much in the setting. But again, it's very like, we don't really know because there's so few studies reporting it. But yeah, it was really interesting. I appreciate the talk.
Yeah, I appreciate all the work that you're doing because it sounds really important. And I agree that primary care is a really great way to potentially break down some of the barriers to receiving care, especially for marginalized or minoritized populations. I think it also makes me think about, I talked a lot about kind of the clinical application of some of this research, but I'm a clinical scientist myself. And so as researchers, we also want to be thinking about what can we do to bridge this gap? We can report race and ethnicity. One of the most frustrating things that I find is when I have done similar systematic reviews or papers, and I'm looking at the literature and we see white and non-white. I'm like, okay, non-white is a huge portion of our population. And I recognize, because I do a lot of statistical consulting as well, that there might be statistical reasons why you're grouping one or more racial ethnic groups together. And yes, perhaps for moderation analyses, for instance, you're grouping certain groups together. That doesn't mean that descriptively you can't still report who's in your sample, and you can't still report descriptives for each racial ethnic group. One thing that was a recent recommendation from a colleague of mine, Jeff Muzel, was also, and this is something that we've started to do since then, is not only asking about clients' races and ethnicities, but also including that racial ethnic identity measure, so that we're not only getting what's the category that folks are checking off, but we see a lot of studies find, oh, race and ethnicity didn't moderate our results, and a lot of really strong conclusions when moderation is not found. But what if it's because the group that they checked off, they don't actually identify with that group? And then it gets into the really tricky work of there's so much that confounds some of the racial ethnic marginalization and the effects of that racial ethnic marginalization. And so, but if we don't have data on it, we just can't know. And so I think that's my plug for reporting race and ethnicity of our participants. I think I had another point that I wanted to make too, but I lost it. But any other questions? Oh, I remember. When you're doing work in primary care and other settings, I think it can also be very tricky. And this is actually how the US Census data used to be collected. Because unless you're asking the client how they identify, and in a primary setting, it can be awkward to come into the room and to say like, oh, and by the way, what's your racial ethnic group? That's usually not how we start conversations with clients. And so sometimes what we can see is that it's done on a visual basis by the provider, that the provider is the one who's checking off the race or ethnicity of the client. And we know that that might not necessarily be accurate either. And so that's what we want to be thinking about too. Is this how the client is actually identifying, or is this the provider collecting the information and doing it based off of visual cues?
I have one more question, and it's more like a pick your brain. I want to hear your thoughts.
Yeah.
I'm very motivated by, everything that comes with cultural sensitivity in clinical work and in research settings. And a lot of the work that happens with acculturation, I feel like makes it seem that the American culture should be the standard. So I just want to hear your brain on how we can be mindful on how we even write our findings so that we're not suggesting that with lower acculturation, there is like lesser outcomes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so I want to say that this is something that can be a little bit more specific to American culture. For instance, when we think about different models of acculturation, there can be this pressure for racial ethnic minoritized people or racial ethnic minoritized immigrants to assimilate to American culture. And we even see some differences in acculturation patterns for people of color who immigrate to the United States versus people from other European nations, for instance, who are immigrating to the United States. We see that this is different in some other Western countries, which do more of what we call integration, which is you are upholding the values, beliefs, and practices of the new country that you immigrated to, but you're still upholding the values, beliefs, and practices of your country of origin as well. So we even see that look different for some other Western nations. I'm getting carried away and I forgot the original question.
How to be mindful in writing.
How to be mindful in writing.
Yes.
Yes, perfect. Okay, we can be mindful in writing. We want to think about the terminology that we use. And I would say really thinking about kind of that institutional accountability here. There can be a lot of the bias that we can have, implicit bias that we can have, is to use language that we might not even consider to be blaming the person, but it can come across that way. And so language, even for instance, I often say there are barriers for racial ethnic minoritized people to receiving services because that conveys that there's some sort of institutional accountability there. There's something that's preventing people from using those services, which can sound very different in a paper than racial ethnic minoritized people don't access services because that puts the onus on the person from the minoritized group. And so I think doing that kind of little step of, well, if we're seeing these disparities, what is the reason for the disparities? And is it possible that there are certain practices, whether that's legal practices, education practices, media practices, that might be creating more barriers for certain groups than for majority groups?
Well, we owe Dr. Park another thank you and round of applause. Thanks for a terrific talk and for answering all those questions. I'm sure people can reach out to you if they have any specific questions to follow up. And thanks for the QR codes that you included as well in the talk.
Yes, of course. Please do reach out. And thank you so much for the invitation. All right. Happy match day.